Hello, everyone. I'm Ruben Espinosa, Interim Director of ACMRS, and I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you to our webinar, Inclusive Futures, Race, Religion, and PCRS. Today's event is part of our summer discussion series, Call and Response, which is generously sponsored by the Institute for Humanities Research here at Arizona State University. We will drop a link in the chat with more information about this series, as well as a link to joining our email list. We see today's event as the start of an important and much needed conversation in our field, and we are immensely grateful to our distinguished panelists for agreeing to join us. So without further ado, it is my honor to welcome our panelists and Patricia Akimi, Director of the Folger Institute, who has graciously agreed to moderate today's conversation.
Hi, everyone. I am Patricia Akimi, and I'm the director of the Folger Institute at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank people, also known as the Anacostans, in an area that served as a trading post for numerous tribes in the larger Chesapeake region, and where today there are over a dozen tribes in the region and an estimated 4,000 indigenous people living in D.C. I'd like to thank the team at ACMRS and Race Before Race for organizing this panel of amazing speakers, especially Em McDonough, Leah Newsom, and Ruben Espinosa. And I want to note for the audience that closed captioning has been turned on and the Q&A box is open and available. So you are welcome to add your questions there at any time during or after the presentations. Our distinguished speakers have agreed to forego sharing their impressive bios. Instead, you can read about each of them on the website for this event. And we will hear today 4 short presentations before we move into our Q&A and discussion, and the panelists will speak today in alphabetical order. This panel is entitled Inclusive Futures, Race, Religion, and PCRS, or Premodern Critical Race Studies. The R in PCRS might well stand for race or religion, or both, since these topics of study overlap, as do the methods of analysis for each, and the archives for the study of each. PCR and RS is based on the study of evidence, both historical and contemporary. It's informed by the personal experiences of the researchers, by the bodies we inhabit, and it reflects an understanding of the limitations of that experience, because it's clear that racist ideology is fed by assumptions about what we know, who we are, what others know, who they are. The productive curiosity at the heart of PCRS prompts us to seek for what has been overlooked or overwritten, to listen for those voices that have been marginalized. And as a result, this work lends itself to acts of collaboration, allyship, and solidarity, and to opportunities for deeper engagement, like this gathering today. Our topic today is the prospective futures of PCRS. And as you'll soon hear, this is a conversation about the diversity and debate that exists within the fields we now call premodern critical race studies, about inclusivity, allyship, about where our work, methods, and archives converge, and about when we disagree, how we disagree. I want to affirm that this is a yes and conversation. Yes and is the spirit in which this gathering was proposed and organized. That doesn't mean we cannot ask hard questions of one another and of ourselves. That's the spirit in which PCRS itself was founded and in which it continues. It does mean that all are welcome to this conversation, and that includes you, our audience. So I want to welcome our panelists and invite them to begin that conversation. And we'll start with Bernadette Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Patricia, to Ruben and the ACMRS team for envisioning and organizing this gathering. To my fellow panelists, I'm looking forward to the conversation. So my contribution to today's roundtable draws on my essay in the forthcoming collection, Shakespeare Skin, edited by Ruben Espinosa and envisioned by David Sterling Brown. This essay, titled Caliban Skin, Racial Hinges and Anti-Racist Kin, works with and against skin as a signifier of race on two registers. The first, the focus of part one, takes as its point of departure the charged debate over the term Islamophobia, which initially gained traction in the late 1990s due to the reactionary dismissal of the term racism as applicable to the stereotypes and structural discrimination Muslims have long experienced in the West, that is, Europe and its settler colonies. We are still caught in this conundrum, and I used the invitation to participate on the 2019 Shakespeare Association of America plenary panel, New Directions in Early Modern Race Studies, to address this term's affordances and limits using a pre-modern critical race studies framework. Drawing on the interventions of Anya Lumba and Kim Hall, among others, I show that signifiers relating to race and Islam are mutually reinforcing in Shakespeare's plays, with my emphasis on the Tempest. This combination, I argue, is fundamental for understanding Islamophobia as an amalgam of residual and emergent modes of racism that imbricate a wide and variable range of somatic and social traits with religion. To make visible the racialization of religion, I adduce Caliban, who is from Algiers through his mother, as a symbolic hinge that opens and closes the doors to whiteness as necessary. Here I draw on Neda Magbouleh's conceptualization in The Limits of Whiteness, Iranian Americans and the Everyday Politics of Race, of the racial hinge for groups positioned in the liminal zone between whites and non-whites, what Charles Mills in The Racial Contract calls borderline cases. In this sense, Caliban as a thing of darkness helps secure Miranda's whiteness, which from a colonialist perspective would be threatened by her potential degeneration on the island. At the same time, because he ultimately reconciles himself to the white spatial imaginary that Prospero enforces, Caliban is complicit in Claribel's exclusion from Europeanness and hence whiteness as a result of her mixed marriage, interracial and interreligious. In part two of my forthcoming essay, I shift registers to dwell on the relationship, but also the distinction between flesh and skin as a way to consider effective, that is effective, allyship, a focus of this roundtable, through the historical understanding of ally as a relative, a relation, a kinsman, or kinswoman. I dedicate part two to my father, who passed away last month, shortly after his 90th birthday. I just returned from Cape Breton Island, on the easternmost shore of Canada, where he was buried. He hailed from the Syrian Lebanese community that migrated to Nova Scotia in the early 20th century and continues as a community to the present. As a scholar seeking to understand all the histories that constitute me, while researching this essay, I learned that Arabs from the Levant, Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, and others from the Arabian Peninsula, fought legal battles in the US from the late 19th century all the way to the eve of World War II to be legally defined as white for the purpose of obtaining U.S. citizenship and all the rights accruing thereunto. This dynamic repeated itself with variations across the Americas. As I conclude, to be allies and accomplices against racism, we, those, depending on the context, red as white from non-European backgrounds, must do what we can to hold space for people who experience racism in the skin and not push for places at the table of neoliberal multiculturalism, which is a poisonous banquet. This means sitting with the liminality, with being on the hinge, with being just outside the door sometimes. This means acknowledging flesh and skin are related, but not the same. I look forward to dialoguing about the implications of bringing these two registers together using a contrapuntal approach that moves us towards anti-racist connections, an ethics of care, and anti-racist action, an ethics of justice in our academic spaces and beyond.
Thank you so much for that, Bernadette, and I'm sorry for your loss. We'll move next to Geraldine Heng. Jerry, you're still muted.
Sorry. I'd like to begin by remembering and acknowledging that I live and work on stolen indigenous land here in Texas. I acknowledge and express respect and gratitude to the elders and the people of the Alabama, Cruzata, Caddo, Carrizo, and Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tigua Pueblo, Tonkawa, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities, past, present, and continuing in the lands and territories of Texas. People in pre-modern critical race studies may be familiar with my research and publication, so I'd like to focus today on teaching. On my campus, the University of Texas at Austin, there are some 24 medievalists spread across 3 colleges and many departments and programs, not to mention classicists of various kinds, and yet nobody seems to want to teach DEI courses for the pre-modern period. This means that DEI courses are all that I teach. I've been doing this now for nearly 3 decades. That's how old I am. Starting with critical teaching of the Crusades in 1994, when students studied Arab chronicles, Jewish chronicles, Greek and Armenian literature before they read Latin materials on the armed incursions and colonizations we call the Crusades. On the morning of September 11, 2001, I was teaching pre-modern race to undergraduates and soon realized I would need to add an anti-Islamophobia course. A decade and a half later, I thought to retire that anti-Islamophobia course, but Donald Trump got elected and hate crimes began to increase exponentially again. Today, pre-1600 critical courses on race, class, colonization, empire, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia are even more necessary given the rise of white supremacists and Christian supremacist movements spouting fantasies about the pre-modern past. Students have also massively diversified in terms of their race, class, countries of origin, sexualities and genders, and physical, cultural, and psychosocial composition. Students of color of all orientation now make up 2/3 of every class I teach. Also, the University of Texas is formerly an HSI now. Despite all this, students tell me there simply aren't enough non-Eurocentric counter-canonical courses for them to take before the modern era. In fact, a few years ago, I was even told by the associate chair of my department, herself a medievalist, to teach more standard Brit Lit. So how do we envision effective allyship in pre-modern studies? The description of today's webinar asks. For starters, we have to replace administrators who want to return us to the 1950s and listen to students when they tell us what they need for their education. In Texas, we also have to fight the legislature. This is a given and ongoing battle, and it will take years. At present, I'm concentrating on furnishing resources for teaching critically early global studies. Teaching the global is a means to oppose pernicious narratives of white Christian European supremacy that purport to represent the deep past historical truths. It's an urgent process of counter-narration that opposes extremist fantasies of a past where Europe took center stage in white societies of unfractured Christian homogeneity, while the histories and cultures of the rest of the world are forgotten and erased. That such erasure and forgetting has pernicious effects is clear from a report by the African-American medievalist Cord Whitaker, who has been repeatedly asked, so where were the Black people in the Middle Ages? Apparently, Cord's otherwise well-educated interlocutors only knew of Africa from histories of slavery and imperialism in the modern era. Non-knowledge about pre-modernity meant that these people, however well-intentioned they might have been, knew nothing of Africa's histories and cultures before the encroachments of the West. Given the outrageousness of such lacunae in teaching and learning, teaching the stories and cultures of the early world in a critical fashion, not in the apolitical descriptive fashion so popular now in the dissemination of a global Middle Ages, can be an act of political and ethical commitment by pre-modernists. Because if there is to be an inclusive future in higher education and elsewhere, people need to learn that history does not begin when Europe arrives.
Thank you so much. And now we'll have Stephanie Shirilan.
Good afternoon. I join you from Syracuse, which stands on the unceded Haudenosaunee territory where I am grateful to be housed. I want to express my profound gratitude to the ACMRS, my esteemed co-panelists, and the organizers, Ruben and Ayana, for their courage in creating a space for this conversation and for their encouragement despite my concerns about speaking for or in the place of others on the question of Jewish inclusion in pre-modern critical race studies. I want to name some of the challenges that such inclusion has faced, challenges that have not been explicit within this community, or not all of them have been made explicit within this community, but some of which I hope my comments today can help us address with critical care. First, the US-centric argument that at least since the Second World War, Jews who were not previously considered to be white entered into structural whiteness in ways that complicate their perceived marginality. Second, a related but separate question as to whether Jewish otherness counts or should count as racialization in the present, in ways that Geraldine Heng has exhaustively demonstrated to be the case in pre-modernity. Third, the underrepresented status of Jews of color, and the problem whereby this designation presumes Jewish whiteness as a default. Inclusion in anti-racist work has also been vexed by the definition of anti-Semitism in some of the ways similar or parallel perhaps to the way that Bernadette had just introduced. The question of its appropriateness as a term that came into use to elevate a so-called scientific view of Jewish inferiority over supposedly outdated religious ones, and its appropriateness as a single term to describe a range of hostilities past, present, regional, and global. Scholars have offered alternatives such as anti-Judaism and Judeophobia, both for these reasons and especially of late, to find ways around political impasses surrounding its use and alleged abuse. Statistics quantifying the rise in US anti-Semitism have been subjected to forms of critique that display a deep distrust in the authority of Jews to serve as witnesses to their own experiences, and suspicions of Jewish power over the state to generate such reports. I want to trace a few of the supersessionary tropes that animate these suspicions and suggest some ways that we might benefit from their deconstruction in pre-modern critical race studies. Supersession, for those who may not be familiar with the term, refers to the doctrine of Christianity's replacement of God's covenant with Israel. Judaism and the so-called Old Testament are characterized as dead stock onto which new Christian life must be grafted. The structural racism of Christian supersession requires the essentialized and irredeemable otherness of the Jew, where Christian mercy forgives, Jewish law punishes, Christian love saves, Jewish law damns, Christianity's spiritual transcendence of the flesh requires Jewish carnality. Life in Christ requires Jewish death. Objections that religion cannot racialize because of its supposed electiveness obscure the ontological violence of the conversion that promises life to Jews precisely on the condition of their death as Jews. We might look to Lindsay Kaplan and Magda Tedder's recent work to observe how this supersessionary framework provides a foundation for white supremacy's anti-Blackness, something we witness in stark relief, at least by the time of the first English translation of the almost certainly forged testimony of a Rabbi Samuel of Fez, whose Christian conversion is figured through the trope of epidermal transformation. This conversionary epistle, which circulated widely throughout Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries, was published under the English title, The Blessed Jew of Morocco, or A Black Moor Made White. As we prepare to discuss what more inclusive anti-racist scholarship might look like and how we can foster more effective forms of allyship within it, I want to note two forms of resistance to the study of Jewish racialization within Jewish studies and or by Jewish scholars. One seems to fear that Jewish racialization as a concept increases its powers of harm. The second worries that Jewish racialization is at least partly the product of a so-called lachrymose Jewish historiography, with its theme of perennial Jewish suffering that must be disavowed by Jews as proof of their commitment to intergroup solidarity. The supersessionary pressures at work here are perhaps not as obvious to those who do not labor underneath them. I urge my colleagues to consider how Jewish bids for inclusion in anti-racist work are sometimes met with suspicions of Jewish passing that evoke fantasies of shapeshifting, of Jews who possess the demonic power to take on the appearance of their hosts and do so both to appropriate the privileges of the dominant group and evade liability for their crimes by claiming victim status. I urge us to consider how some of our critical practices, including the critique of a capital H history, which I share, can lean on caricature of the historian as a stubborn adherent to benighted regimes, a caricature that evokes the deaf and blind, hard-hearted and stiff-necked Jew whose resistance to salvation is couched in an enslavement to old books and their overly literal and legalistic interpretation. I urge us further to consider how Jewish racial reckoning is beset by the undue burden of proving its and our integrity against supersessionary fantasies that as keepers of the book, or Jewish bookkeepers, Jews manipulate the ledgers in order to capitalize not just off the suffering of others, but our own suffering, and that the embellishment of this trauma or denial of its just cause as wages for our sin makes a usurious something out of nothing. If my own account sounds eternalist, I want to underscore the opposite by calling with an open heart inspired by the courage of my colleagues upon the transformative potential of pre-modern critical race studies to respond more capaciously still to the challenge and promise of intersectionality, to create more space for the study of the complex enmeshment of racialized groups that, along with the histories of collaboration, includes histories and legacies of antagonism and tension we do ill to shy away from, not least because our work is uniquely poised to expose them as products of Christian white supremacy, and because unexamined, they continue to serve as the instruments of its perpetuation. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we'll have Lehua Yim.
Aloha mai kākou, o Lehua Yim ko uinoa, no ko lau poko o ahu mai au. I ke manawa noho au ma ko lau poko nei. Having been raised in ko lau poko o ahu, I'm so lucky today to be able to speak to you from my homeland and my home nation. I'm grateful to be in conversation with these esteemed and brilliant colleagues hosted by ACMRS. My thanks to Ayana, Ruben, the ACMRS staff, Patricia, my co-panelists, and colleagues throughout the Shake race and Native and Indigenous studies fields. Mahalo for holding space for what is quite difficult. Racing as an ongoing project of domination certainly affects Weaving nations, peoples, and communities, and the rich scholarly exchanges between Black critical race and Afro-pessimist theorists and critical Indigenous theorists, as well as amidst historians of US-based Black and Native histories. These exchanges are ongoing, brilliant, and difficult. Diverse anti-racist scholars bring in their totality a powerful intervention into structural racism. So rather than talk about what an analytic of race might be excluding, let me start with some truisms collected in my journey through early modern studies. And Leah, if you don't mind, the first text slide. I think there's one more slide, yeah. Number 2. I'm not going to read these, but I just want them up here. These statements certainly can be unpacked with an analytic of race. Indigeneity as a property of an individual can be critiqued as a kind of race making, where a colonial adjective becomes consolidated as a transhistorical and transcultural identity form. And anthropocentrism is always already raced as it travels through organized religions' justifications of dominion and the structure organized around man as center of a world made for him. But what do we make of the continuing myths and scholarship that conquest was total, successful, and concluded in the early modern European past? Or that OEV nations, peoples, and communities just disappeared or were completely dispossessed of their commons, of their property held in common? Or that the job of the scholar is to speak about and for the indigenous, as if they and their descendants are not still living their lifeways, governing their nations, and keeping their own expertises and histories. The fantasies and myths that swirl in place of OEV existences and worlds remain undisturbed by anti-racist critique. The continuing deployment without question of constructs like nature, ecologies, environment, space, landscape, lands and waters, as if they were material givens in the world, is an abiding settler colonial violence that undermines liberatory aspiring early modern studies scholarship. To not question those constructs is to foreclose OEV languages and world makings. To simply remain satisfied with a naturalized symbolic order made whole and stable by the continual silencing and violent exclusion of a multitude of OEV-centered onto-epistemic structures and languages is not a critical enough praxis. We have so much to consider whether early modern studies is incomplete when it cannot also recognize the importance of this and this and this, this, and this. The start of a chant offered at the arrival of a 12th century voyaging chief. Here's Hawaii, an island, a man. A man is Hawaii. Hawaii, a man, a child of Tahiti. The diverse multiplicity of OEV-centered worlds and ways spring forth from the countless actual places that they belong to. Emplacement, sort of awkward name in English that has to serve me here, is what continually escapes much of critical race and post-colonial theoretical work. Thus, insights from critical indigenous theories and OEV centering histories are also useful in studying pre-modern British and European cultural objects and historical developments because of a heightened attentiveness to place, as well as methods for how to perceive and analyze multi-structuralisms in the relationships created by place. If race is also a catachresis, holding the place of what can have no name, then PCRS can make place for what cannot really be itself in the colonizers' languages. Maybe going forward, we really need to have many more conversations inside the hale, inside the house. But it's going to take a leap of faith and trust and a willingness to ask for how to do this in a pono, in a just, balanced, good, and righteous way. Thank you.
And to everyone in the audience, what an amazing range of approaches to this very broad field we've just heard. I'm going to take a few minutes to ask a question of my own while we give the audience time to put their questions in the Q&A. But I think there's already some applause in the Q&A, just so you know. But I think that it's important to say that the spirit of this panel is to invite questions, even tough ones, so we're ready. So the question I have for each of the panelists today has to do with what Stephanie called the promise and the challenges of intersectionality. I think it would be really helpful to give our audience a window into the nature of the work that each of you do. And I noticed that in each of your talks, you mentioned some piece of evidence, some artifact, some text that for you is illustrative of intersectionality, of the necessity of intersectional approaches in our work. And what was really interesting to me also was that there's a connection between a pre-modern moment and a contemporary, and in some cases, even a personal moment. And I'm going to mention some of those to refresh our memory. So Stephanie, you mentioned the 14th century document with the 1648 translation, the Blessed Jew of Morocco, or a Blackamoor made white. And I think I can guess what happens in that text based on the title, but I thought that I would love to hear more about what that text sort of inspires for you. Bernadette, you invoked Caliban, of course, in The Tempest, but also the legal battles of Arabs seeking US citizenship by seeking to be recognized as white. I see that those are connected for you. I would love to hear you talk about why. Jerry, you mentioned in talking about the pedagogy that you've developed, that you make sure that students are reading Arab and Jewish chronicles, Greek and Armenian literature before they read Latin texts about what we sometimes refer to as the Crusades. And Lehua, you showed us a variety of objects, material, ephemeral, textual, and you noted for us that each one of these objects is not commonly recognized as fundamental to our study of the era that we might call early modern or pre-modern, and that moreover, these are objects that can't be understood without appreciating what you called emplacement, having a sense of the places to which they belong. So for any of the panelists, if you'd like to take us into your exploration of that piece of evidence or any other, I think that would be really wonderful.
Suppose I could jump in.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists. I know I'm going to go back and I'm going to listen to all these talks and really benefit from them already. I have so much I'm pondering. But your question, Patricia, was about the power challenge of intersectionality. I think, and you addressed some specifics from my talk. And I think really the one thing I'll touch on is the question of whiteness. And I'm going to address that because I think sometimes in our analyses in pre-modern critical race studies, we slip into representing whiteness as if it's ontological. Whiteness is an ontological, whiteness is a political construct, an imperialist construct, always in relation to anti-Blackness. So I shared a bit about my history and then about larger histories that I've studied. And I mean, even today, and again, the US Census is a technology of imperialism, settler colonialism, anti-Blackness, the expropriation of Native peoples and their lands. So, but even today in 2020, Lebanese are listed specifically, and Egyptians, check your white box. So there's a construction there of whiteness, and there's histories to it. And those histories are related in relation to settler colonialism that are uncomfortable for people who are not from European backgrounds to address in some ways. And so we really need to, I think you use the word intersectionality, but I think we need to do a lot more work in terms of the local, in terms of context with respect to race making, and also in terms of then the global as as Jerry was so incisively addressing. So that's just the beginning of a provocation. And the last thing I'll share is these are local. Actually, I started this because I was born in Canada in the 1960s. And my birth certificate, the birth certificates then, for historical reasons, had neither Black nor white. So my race is Syrian on my birth certificate. So, you know, there's a lot for us to unpack going forward, and we've got to do this local work. And I didn't use intersectional, I used contrapuntal, because we have to talk about the historical and then the contemporary and the personal, because those histories aren't over, as we just heard.
You know, it's funny because I started working on, I've been working on critical race as well as a critical global studies for about the same amount of time. One was resisted massively by premodernists. There was so much resistance. Race was resisted, but not the global. The global was embraced and people took it and ran with it immediately and became a big phenomenon. Everybody's doing the global now. This is because they think doing the global is not political work. You know, they think it's just additive and descriptive, right? We used to know a lot about Egypt. Now let's know more about India, China, Africa, and so on. But, you know, I mean, so, and a lot of the time when it's done, especially, I hate to say this, in the UK, it is done in this kind of sanitized and sort of apolitical, you know, descriptive, additive sort of way, which is not how I conceptualize of a critical global studies at all, right? I mean, but you know, it's doing the global is also about doing race. It's also about doing PCRS, you know, but it's doing it in a global context, right? It's doing it beyond the borders of like the West. And we are mostly, a lot of us are trained, you know, as Europeanists or as Americanists, and are comfortable with what we know, with our knowledges. It involves often dealing with your own discomfort and your own non-knowledge, requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of working with others, including one's students. It involves involving students as interlocutors and researchers, not just as there to be taught. I learn as much or more from my students as they do from me. You know, when I teach the global, course content requires lots of research on their part. And I tell them their research is an important part of course content. It's not, you know, that I never give exams and quizzes. I do not give people things and then they give me back what I just told them. You know, they go out and find things. It's meant to be transformative. It's meant for them to understand, you know, like before there was an imaginary Wakanda, there was Mali and Songhai and Ghana and Nubia and Ethiopia and Great Zimbabwe and Benin and the Swahili coast. I need them to know these things, and I need them to understand what it means, that what the erasure of the rest of the world, you know, or like the non-knowledge of the deep history of the world means, you know. It's like, why is it, you know, like, why do they think people know only about what happens when Europe arrives, right? We know what happens when Europe arrives, and it is tremendously important, but you should not, it's important that the rest of the world not be relegated to a position of non-knowledge, of like erasure, non-existence, and so on. When Cord first told me what people said, you know, like, where were the Black people from the Middle Ages? I was so enraged. I couldn't even think about how to respond to this for days because I was so enraged, you know. So anyway, some of this is from a position of rage, you know, like you work from a position, you either work on what you love or what you are enraged about. Some of us work on what we are tremendously enraged about. So the mission for me right now is to show people that when you do global studies, you have to do it critically. You have to do it in thinking in terms of race, in terms of empire, colonization, histories from below, marginalized histories, everything. You know, it's not just, okay, you know, we all know about, you know, we know about, you know, the West. Now we need to know a little bit more about this and a little bit more about that, and a little bit more about this and so on. It's work that needs to be transformative. So students do a lot of research. They've been uncovering their own deep histories of their families, of their societies, of their languages and cultures, and their indigenous pasts. and indigenous futures merging into one. You know, it's tremendously exciting work. And for me, it happens a lot in the classroom. I'm in the middle of trying to finish a Cambridge element called Teaching Early Global Literatures and Cultures. It's very hard. It's very hard. Some of it's very scary, but I will finish it this year or bust. That's all I want to say. It's basically more an outburst than anything else.
I see that there are questions coming in the chat, so I want to give Stephanie and Lehua a chance to respond, and then we'll go to those.
You want to go first? Are you ready or no? Yeah, really weird, upsetting text with a really provocative title. It's not actually something that I have been working much on. I actually encountered it in the course of preparing for this talk, which is also part of preparation I'm doing for a chapter that I, speaking of the personal, have only recently am still in the process of developing the courage to include in my book project. I've been working for a number of years on a book on air and breath, and part of its purpose, part of its aspiration, when you start talking about breath, the spiritus and all of its different variations, the form of the word show up everywhere, and I'm starting with this, the aspiration of that book carries that, right? But part of its thinking is trying to trace the long histories of whose breathing in history has been protected and whose breathing has been made precarious. And of course, in the context of doing this work through 2020 and the rising to the status of an anthem in Black Lives Matter of the protest I Can't Breathe, has made me feel anxious in ways that probably bled through my presentation about what it means for me to do a history of non-specifically Black and non-post-American institutional enslavement Black respiratory precarity. So much so that I sometimes express my anxiety that if I were to draw attention to a prehistory of religiously based respiratory precarity, is doing so, where am I picking up the messages from this? But how do I reconcile with the perception I have that to draw attention to or to take the air to devote to the precarity of other histories of breathing bodies and of marginalized breathing bodies puts the bodies who are struggling for respiratory freedom and equality at greater risk. I'd be curious to know whether other people who are working on non-Black or on anti-racist work that doesn't feature the history of enslavement and institutional slavery in the United States and Black bodies also struggle with this feeling of an allyship that I, for reasons that I've tried to articulate through the supersessionary stuff, I'm suspicious of some of the tropes that I feel require me in very particularly scripted ways to be more cautious about the perception of my usurpation, of my passing, of the kinds of claims I'm making, of the kinds of authority that I want to vest in the importance of the history of Jewish trauma. But I'd be curious to know what other people's experiences are around that. I'll just say quickly about that chapter. So I'm working on a new chapter on Shylock's bated breath. That's the text from which we get the expression bated breath. And Shylock, of course, in something that I'm studying through various performances, performs almost always in performance, enters into the performance that he describes he's going to perform. Sir, yesterday on the Rialto, you spat at me, spat at my Jewish garb. Should I now, with bated breath, come to you and say, oh, right, that's how you treated me yesterday, but you want to borrow monies? I should lend you monies? And what he does is he says, shall I with bated breath in a bondsman's key, just doing all kinds of interesting work, of course. The invocation here of respiratory dis-ease, respiratory, the sound of labored breathing that my project is trying to argue after the Reformation becomes naturalized to laboring bodies and to other bodies who do not have access to a kind of a grace after the Reformation that becomes equated with respiratory ease, is here very clearly a religious one, but it's one also that's drawing on the tropes of bondage, a bondage that of course is being industrialized as the backdrop for that moment.
Like I'm adding another voice to a really interesting quartet here. And so I think I'll try to also pick up a little bit what I thought a question from Kathleen in the Q&A. You know, I think in the preparation for this particular talk, I found myself really digging down deep into a theoretical set of conversations that we just don't have enough time in our days to really engage. And for some of us, I mean, I had a very particular kind of training with a very particular kind of intellectual genealogy that deeply into deconstruction. So I wanted to use some of those things, not because I think they're useful in the sort of ways that we thought they were useful in the 90s and early 2000s, but because what happens when there's a figure like catachresis, or the abuse, right? The figure of abuse, where the metaphor is so remote. Like the entirety of figuration is built on the notion of what is a proper word to describe whatever this is, and how close or how distant those kinds of relationships of propriety are. And the sort of geography of figuration that you see, or spatialization. And I feel like when we really engage with the sort of real tricky questions of the irreducibility of our figuration, of our discursive production, that when I put pictures up of the cliffs of Aquinnah on Naope, Martha's Vineyard, or if I put up the Churro Wampum Belt, or if I begin a chant that is meant to be an oral presentation, I want to say also that, you know, of course, these are signifying acts, but are they objects? And why is it that when we think we need to know something, that the first completely naturalized, invisible gesture is to extract and objectify and move it along in the stream of commerce? So, you know, that also ties into your question about intersectionality. I think that, and I think of this as a legal person as well, you know, coming out of Crenshaw, and also coming out of Cheryl Harris, who had it was a really fascinating conversation that I recommend to everybody between Jody Bird and Cheryl Harris about why we keep talking past each other in America when it comes to Black theory and Indigenous theory. And it is so fraught. But I think a lot of it comes down to this idea of what is proper and what is proprietary and what is property, of course, if you're talking about Cheryl Harris. And whether whiteness as property is a sufficient universal explanation. I mean, I say it, but of course the answer is it's not, because deconstruction, right? We all know there is a lack. And so I'm trying to get us to understand collectively in relation with my colleagues and in our communities that the lack doesn't mean conquered, exterminated. Like those are the constructs that are there to explain the need to expel that which will completely undermine the authority of the state and the mode of production that we live in.
Thanks, everyone. We do have some questions in the chat, and I think we'll have time to get to at least one or two of them. So the first question is from Kathleen Lynch, which Lehua alluded to a little bit, and let me read it. These are fascinating and important examples of the need for emplacement in developing anti-racist teaching and research. What versions of rethinking our sense of temporality, as in historical periods, can also advance that work? And I ask understanding that the formulation of the premodern is itself a move in that direction.
I'll jump in. It's everybody. I was waiting. but all I'll do is very briefly expand on, the methodology I emphasized was the contrapuntal, which of course comes from Edward Said, and actually through his emphasis on literature, on history, but also his own background as a musician, a concert level pianist. And music, of course, is experienced temporally. It doesn't really relate to the notion of emplacement per se, but there's something about a certain sort of temporality and embodiment. And so as a methodology to, what I shared was oscillating between registers, but it's not really an oscillation, again, because these histories are connected, as long as we aren't trying to force some continuity and we're looking at the local, the specificity. But I would say for my longer article, I was profoundly inspired by Ruben Espinosa's. I know he's probably off camera, so I won't embarrass him, but Ruben Espinosa's Shades of Racism, and how through his deep scholarship and his many decades of deep scholarship in literature and emphasis on Shakespeare and on history, was able to take that risk, because it's a risk to then interject the lived experience of the present, coming from our own positionalities, but through allyships as well, which I know is a crucial exploration in that amazing book.
There's a great deal of scholarship on like periodization and on the slow dissolving or erosion of the boundary between modern and pre-modern. It's a lot of us have worked on questions of periodization and what they signify. And there are many cross-temporal conversations now between modernists and pre-modernists of all kinds. I think that's very important because we can see resemblances, we can see reinscriptions, we can see, like homologies, we can see various things. This should not make people who would like to attack our work say that we are therefore naive and think that there's nothing but continuity. Any of us who has read a modicum of Foucault or anyone else understand about epistemic differences, understand that there are ruptures, but there are also reinscriptions. We are not talking about continuities in some naive sort of mid-20th century kind of way, Although I do see from occasional articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education and so on, there was somebody who attacked everyone working on PCRS, for example, just about all of us, for thinking that there are continuities and we are working on continuities. It was so naive and so ignorant, I don't think anybody bothered to respond to it. We just all kind of moved on and went and did something else instead. What I do want to stress, though, is that as we work transhistorically and as we have these important conversations, we are also mindful of historical specificities. Like slavery in the pre-modern period looks different, in the classical period looks different from early modern slavery and from slavery today, contemporary slavery, for example. There are important differences that we also have to articulate and to be conscious of, even as we see reinscriptions, and adaptations and reuses, like we see the parsimony of history, we see reinscriptions, and we see how there are differences that get reinscribed, and in interesting ways. So we do talk across periods and temporalities, but those of us who work carefully, and I think that's all of us here, are also mindful of like specific differences that seem to characterize phenomena, events, institutions in particular historical periods. Historical period could be 10 years, it did not necessarily be like, 100 years or centuries or whatever. But this is an interesting question, and I think it speaks directly to the ways in which PCRS is being attacked now by people who do not want to see PCRS to thrive, May I try to just quickly, I don't know how much time we have, answer the question by Joe da Costa? I know that's sort of skipping the...
Jerry, we have
the
1 minute, so if you can give the world to answer that.
I just want to say to Joe da Costa that even though you are working with materials where Indigenous views are being only filtered through European colonialist, imperialist views, I co-edited a Cambridge series on the global Middle Ages. And one of the things I'm interested in is like the recovery of Indigenous voices through medievalisms. You may, I mean, sometimes there are parts of the world where recovery is more difficult than others for a variety of reasons. I mean, the oral traditions and performative traditions and rituals may be stronger than written traditions and other things. There may be lots of different reasons. It could be because of colonial work. But a way to recover the deep past for me is through medievalisms, through like what people have remembered, what kinds of rituals they have continued to perform, what kinds of stories they've continued to tell, artifacts that they've created stories around for generations. And I want to make sure that these voices are heard. I'm trying to put together a cluster of global medievalisms, that feature these sorts of recoveries from the past, with the understanding that there is always a conversation between those who are in the present, telling these stories and reenacting these performances and dances and rituals and theater and everything else, and the past. We understand these things. We are not naive about what we do, but that interaction, that conversation is important to recover. That's all. This is just a quick answer to Joe.
Thanks, Jerry. I've been given the green light that we're allowed to go over an extra minute or two. So I'd like to read Joe DaCosta's question, and if anyone else wanted to weigh in, so I think it speaks to the overarching theme of this panel. I work on 16th century natural histories and nautical science in Portugal. It's very difficult to read any agency from the subjects in these European documents because they are not given a voice, or their voice is ventriloquized through the European perspective. Alongside the centering of marginalized voices, is there any value in exposing the methodologies by which erasures were enacted by Europeans and still are? Steph, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, there are other people who I think can speak more readily to this or more urgently to this, but just because I didn't get a chance to answer you about your question about that document, maybe I'll just give that as an example. This conversionary epistle, so-called, gets Latinized Maroquitanus from Morocco. Maroquitanus, this is this person who may or may not have existed, I think probably not, Samuel of Fez, who provides in this supposed conversionary testimony or epistle 27 chapters worth of arguments to refute Jewish opposition to accepting Christ. And the circulation of this document, there's a whole literature, this is a whole genre of arguments to refute objections to Christianity. So we can do a lot, I think. We can do a lot of really interesting work by looking at how hard we see this, this invention, the strategies of ventriloquizing. Obviously, I'm offering supersession as a particular tool that we can see, or a tool that we can use to deconstruct its power in a text like this. But I'm thinking either Geraldine or someone else may want to jump in here. But I think that particular genre is a really interesting instance. It's precisely when I think the erasure of the voice is enacted through the invention of the voice of the other. And of course, those of us who work on drama have to deal with this a lot. Caliban has already been mentioned in this conversation today. Sometimes in the lyricism of Caliban's famous speech, particular, The Isle is Full of Noises, we can be troubled and even paralyzed by the problem here of not hearing the other speak for him, herself, theirself. or we can really think about as in ways that my co-panelists and so many of us in the field, so many other people in the field have theorized so brilliantly. We can look at the particular structures of ventriloquism, of the construction of caricature, of the devices and ways that that is produced. And sometimes through that unpacking, we can ask questions. Another thing I'll also point to, Christina Sharp's term wake work was echoing in my head earlier. And echoing back to somebody, I think it was Bernadette who was talking about, maybe Geraldine, that we are embodied historians and scholars, and that we carry the wake within us. In preparation, actually, for this event, I updated my 10-year-old bio on my website, and I struggled over whether or not to include some pieces of my own family's migratory history, how much to share, how not to share, partly because I think I was wary of the ways that, not to say that we produce the silences around or the assumptions that are made about our racialization, but that sometimes the pressures and the fears, and indeed acknowledging the freedoms, the differential freedoms and flexibilities that people have depending on the ways in which they're racialized, to disclose or not disclose. But I too am a recent American, born in Canada. Hi, Bernadette. But I'm thinking about how one of the ways that we might explore that hinge, I'm really thinking about the hinge between the flesh and the skin, between the local and the global, is to do a much more attentive and, I want to say, tactile attention to the textures, to the grades of the local, that I think support the work of thinking about the global, because it's in those very local and specific emplacements that we get the itineracy and the history of global enmeshment.
Exactly. And I think what you've said also responds to some extent to what Heather Maring has typed into the chat.
I wish we had time to do another question, but we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank the panelists for those provocative papers and remind the audience that this session has been recorded. So if you'd like to revisit any of the remarks you've heard today, you'll be able to view them on the ACMRS YouTube channel. Thanks, everybody.
So much for organizing this, everyone, and for participating.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care.